Well, let's take our Bibles this morning and let's open up to the book of Genesis. That's right, we're going back into the book of Genesis today, starting our summer series as we have for the past, this will mark our fourth year studying the book of Genesis, or our fourth summer. And in general, we take about a chapter a week, sometimes a couple of weeks on one chapter, as we will with this one. But we resume our study where we left off last August, actually, and we pick up in Genesis chapter 30. We're going to have a marvelous time in these chapters together and see the faithfulness of God again so profoundly. So look with me at Genesis chapter 30 and follow along as I read verses 1 through 24. Now, when Rachel saw that she bore Jacob no children, she became jealous of her sister, and she said to Jacob, "Give me children, or else I die." Then Jacob's anger burned against Rachel, and he said, "Am I in the place of God, who has withheld from you the fruit of the womb?" She said, "Here is my maid Bilhah. Go into her, that she may bear on my knees, that through her I too may have children." So she gave him her maid Bilhah as a wife, and Jacob went into her. Bilhah conceived and bore Jacob a son. Then Rachel said, "God has vindicated me, and has indeed heard my voice, and has given me a son." Therefore she named him Dan. Rachel's maid Bilhah conceived again, and bore Jacob a second son. So Rachel said, "With mighty wrestlings I have wrestled with my sister, and I have indeed prevailed." And she named him Naphtali. And when Leah saw that she had stopped bearing, she took her maid Zilpah and gave her to Jacob as a wife. And Leah's maid Zilpah bore Jacob a son. Then Leah said, "How fortunate!" So she named him Gad. Leah's maid Zilpah bore Jacob a second son. Then Leah said, "Happy am I, for women will call me happy." So she named him Asher. Now in the days of wheat harvest, Reuben went and found mandrakes in the field and brought them to his mother Leah. Then Rachel said to Leah, "Please give me some of your son's mandrakes." But she said to her, "Is it a small matter for you to take my husband? And would you take my son's mandrakes also?" So Rachel said, "Therefore he may lie with you tonight in return for your son's mandrakes." Then Jacob came in from the field in the evening. Then Leah went out to him and said, "You must come in to me, for I have surely hired you with my son's mandrakes." So he lay with her that night. God gave heed to Leah, and she conceived and bore Jacob a fifth son. Then Leah said, "God has given me my wages, because I gave my maid to my husband." So she named him Issachar. Leah conceived again and bore a sixth son to Jacob. Then Leah said, "God has endowed me with a good gift. Now my husband will dwell with me, because I have borne him 6 sons." So she named him Zebulun. Afterward, she bore a daughter and named her Dinah. Then God remembered Rachel, and God gave heed to her and opened her womb. So she conceived and bore a son and said, "God has taken away my reproach." She named him Joseph, saying, "May the Lord give me another son." Let's pray together. Our Father, we thank you for showing us the wild contours of the curse of sin, also that your faithfulness might be highlighted. Help us to see that truth, to understand your word, to embrace it in faith, and to walk faithfully with Christ because of what we learn and hear today. We pray in the name of our Savior, the Lord Jesus Christ. Amen. Well, if you ever needed an illustration of why God's original plan for marriage, being one man with one woman for life, is the best plan, you need look no further than Genesis chapter 30, do you? Perhaps it is this passage also when the man Agur in Proverbs chapter 30, who was likely teaching his son some lessons, made this statement in Proverbs 30, verse 21 through 23. Under 3 things the earth quakes, and under 4 it cannot bear up. Under a slave, when he becomes king, and a fool, when he is satisfied with food, and under an unloved woman, when she gets a husband, and a maidservant, when she supplants her mistress. I wonder if he had this passage in mind. Genesis chapter 30 is a brutally honest passage illustrating the wild, winding contours of sin, and thankfully also highlighting for us the wonderfully faithful approach that God takes to his people when they do sin. Genesis 12 really began the historical account for us all the way back in that early chapter. It's the historical account of God's faithful promise to a man named Abraham, a promise that would indeed bring blessing to all of the nations of the earth. And with Genesis 12 and that foundational chapter, Genesis 12 also begins the historical account of Abraham's and his family's really wandering at times, manipulative attempts to achieve their own personal sinful desires. Haven't we seen that time and time again? From the time that God gave his wonderful promise to Abraham, even up to this very moment, we have seen Abraham and his family wandering around, winding through the contours of personal sin, trying to manipulate the promise of God to achieve their own desires for themselves. We've seen it over and over again. In fact, this past Friday afternoon, I was reviewing some of the titles that I had given to each of our studies since Genesis chapter 12, and it is remarkable to see this ongoing theme. For example, back in chapters 13 and 14, I called the message on those chapters, Responding to God's Promises After We Fail. If you remember chapter 12, when Abraham had sinfully and lied and suggested that his wife was actually his sister when he was in Egypt. And then chapters 13 and 14 show wonderful repentance and renewal and the faithfulness of God even after that failure. Genesis chapter 20, that's where Abraham committed the same kind of lying sin again with his wife Sarah, and I called that chapter An Unrighteous Prophet, a Righteous Pagan, and Our Faithful God. Genesis chapter 21, I described that one as God's constancy through our inconsistencies. That was the record of Isaac's birth, which brought about Sarah's hateful response toward Hagar. You remember Genesis 27, Jacob's deception of his brother Esau? I entitled that God's Promises Amidst Our Deceptions. And this morning, I have entitled this section of Genesis chapter 30, The Contours of the Curse and the Faithfulness of God. There's an obvious running theme from the time that God gave Abraham the eternal promise of divine blessing for all the nations of the earth, which is an anchor promise that actually shapes the rest of the Bible. There's an obvious theme running from that moment all the way up to this, and really throughout the rest of the book. And it's this theme, that human sin creates a winding road of human attempts to accomplish selfish pursuits. Human sin creates a winding road of human attempts to accomplish selfish pursuits. And yet, the curves in the road of the human journey, when viewed from God's ultimate kind of aerial viewpoint, they look fascinatingly straight. I find this so helpful. I actually find it comforting. I hope you do as well. It's just like what we've been seeing in the book of Hebrews, especially in that marvelous 7th chapter that we've been studying. We see the wonderful provision of God to give us an ultimate high priest who is constantly interceding for us, we, the people who would easily fall away from the Lord in our own sin. He is always preserving His people. We're seeing that same truth in this narrative account in the Old Testament. When God makes a promise, He keeps His promise. Despite and even within the winding contours of willful, human, sinful manipulation springing from the curse of sin that began all the way back in Genesis chapter 3. So this morning we're going to see this particular truth. This truth will really wind its way through the first 24 verses. And it's actually a truth we'll see over and over again, but it's really highlighted today. And that truth is this: the winding contours of the curse of sin never manipulate the straight line of God's faithfulness. Let me say that again. The winding contours of the curse of sin never manipulate the straight line of God's faithfulness. That's the anchor truth that we see in this passage this morning. Now, how do we see it? How do we see that beautiful truth of God's faithfulness in this account of sinfully conniving, manipulative attempts for selfish exaltation? Well, here's what we're going to see this morning. 3 specific contours of sin's curse that actually end up highlighting for us God's ultimate faithfulness. That's what the first 24 verses are going to yield for us. 3 different contours of the curse of sin, just replaying the curse of sin that we see in Genesis chapter 3, replaying it again in this scene, but in a way that actually highlights the marvelous faithfulness of God. So 3 contours of the curse of sin that end up highlighting the faithfulness of God to keep His promise. Let's look at the first one in the first 8 verses. The first contour of sin's curse I've titled here as jealous manipulation. Jealous manipulation. I mean, you see it in verse 1. When Rachel saw that she bore Jacob no children, she became what? Jealous of her sister. Now, just to pick up the idea of where this jealousy came from and why it is so white hot, look back at chapter 29 and verse 30 just for a moment. Just look back at verse 30 in chapter 29. You remember this whole account when Jacob was duped. He thought he was marrying Rachel. Rachel's father slipped in Leah, the older sister, on the night of the marriage, and Jacob woke up in the morning and saw that it was Leah, and so he's married Leah, and then he also works another 7 years, and he gets Rachel as a wife. And verse 30 says, so Jacob went into Rachel also, and indeed he loved Rachel more than Leah, and he served with Laban for another 7 years. Now the Lord saw that Leah was unloved, and He opened her womb, but Rachel was barren. And the rest of chapter 29 goes on to unveil how Leah has 4 children right off the bat, as if in the first 4 years of marriage, one right after the other, she has 4 children, and Rachel has none. And that explains in verse 1 why Rachel is so jealous when she saw that she bore no children. Now, obviously, that's an indication that she was actively trying to have children. Jacob was faithful to his responsibility as a husband to his wife in intimacy and in marriage, and yet she's having no children, and her older sister Leah is fruitful. And notice, when she couldn't get what she desperately wanted, and when her sister had an abundance of what she craved, jealousy set in. Fruitfulness and childbearing, that is in the Mosaic law that you would read later on in the books of Exodus through Deuteronomy. Fruitfulness and childbearing would be noted to be a blessing from God. Even Psalm 127 says that children are a gift from God. But many people in the ancient Near East, the days of which Abraham and his descendants were living, and in the region in which they lived, many people believed that childbearing was a sign not just of a gift from God, but this was a sign of actually God's favor. And then consequently, barrenness then would be a sign of God's disfavor. Now, obviously, that's a wrong idea, but it was a prevalent one. That's probably why we see it so many times in the book of Genesis and in other places where barrenness seems to have a sense of the curse to it, and then God blesses the barren with the gift of children, but not after a great conflict like we see here. Here we see Rachel was the wife Jacob loved, the wife that Jacob actually wanted, but she was not the one who could actually give him an heir, and an heir was key to the promise being fulfilled. So perhaps Rachel was fearful. She might lose his love, might lose his affection and devotion in comparison to her more fertile sister. And that's where the jealousy raged. But it didn't need to, did it? Jealousy didn't need to rage within her, even in this moment that would obviously disquiet her soul and cause her to long to have children. It didn't have to be jealousy. I mean, where was the humble, God-centered response of someone like Hannah? You remember Hannah in 1 Samuel chapter 1, the mother of the prophet Samuel? In 1 Samuel chapter 1, you can read the first 9 verses on your own. I'll just refer to a few verses here. But Hannah had a husband named Elkanah, and he was married to 2 women, Hannah and another, Peninnah. And the text says in verse 4 of 1 Samuel chapter 1, when the day came that Elkanah sacrificed, he would give portions to Peninnah his wife, and also her sons and her daughters, because Peninnah had lots of kids. But to Hannah, who had no children, he would give a double portion because he loved Hannah. But the Lord had closed her womb. Very similar situation to what we're seeing here in Genesis 30. And her rival, that is Peninnah, the rival to Hannah, however, would provoke her bitterly to irritate her because the Lord had closed her womb. And yet, how did Hannah respond? You read the rest of chapter 1, and she pours her heart out to God. Yes, she's saddened. Yes, there's a disquietness about her soul, and yet she pleads with the Lord, pours herself out in humility before God, and He blesses her with a son, Samuel, who becomes a prophet and a judge in Israel. That's how it could have been for Rachel. It didn't have to be jealousy. It could have been humility and dependence on God and His goodness. Instead, she acted more like her grandmother-in-law, Sarah. You remember Genesis 16 and Sarah, when she was barren and wanted to have a child that would perpetuate the promise that God had made? She gave her maidservant Hagar to Abraham. Genesis 16:4 says he went into Hagar, that is, Abraham went into Hagar, and she conceived. But notice this, you remember this, when Sarah saw that Hagar had conceived, her mistress was despised in her sight. Hagar hated Sarah, and there was a battle that began and raged with Hagar and Sarah. Perpetuates down to this woman, Rachel. Now, I want you to see how this jealous manipulation manifests itself in Rachel. We'll walk through this kind of quickly, but I want you to see some of the details. When jealousy grabs your heart, when jealousy grabs anybody and begins to manipulate circumstances, what comes out of it? Well, we've got some illustrations of that here. We see one of these manifestations of jealous manipulation in verse 1, and I call it an overstated despair. It's an overstated despair. I mean, look at verse 1. She's jealous of her sister, and so what does she say to Jacob? Give me children or else I die. Where's the appeal to the Lord here? Instead of an appeal to God, there's a demand of Jacob, and it is an overstated despair, or I die. It's a misplaced anger that leads to an overstated despair. As one commentator noted, this is the only real description of Rachel and Jacob's marriage that we have in the record. It's so sad to see such a beautiful love story provide this lingering picture of their relationship. If this is all we really see of their marriage relationship, this really is sad, especially the way it began with such love at first sight. Now, more than likely, what is she saying here? More than likely, she's thinking of either taking her own life. If you don't give me a child, I'll take my own life. Or perhaps she's thinking that the intensity of her jealousy is so fierce, so enraged, that it will cause her to physically die. She doesn't see herself living on if she can't have children. I mean, what's her life if she doesn't have any children? It's essentially what she's saying, and it's really tragic too. I mean, you have to hear this phrase in your mind, especially when you read Genesis 35, verses 16 and 19, and you can look it up at some point, but Genesis 35 in verse 16 is when she has another son. She eventually has one son at the end of this section. She'll have another one, Benjamin. And in giving birth to Benjamin, she actually dies. But I want you to see what jealousy will actually do to a person. It leads you to a kind of despair that makes you hate life itself. This is a person who's so wrapped up in lust for some object, some status, some demand on life itself, that it literally consumes their life. You ever find those kinds of feelings at work in your heart? You ever find those kinds of affections at work in you in comparison to your lusts and your cravings, your longings? You ever find your longings becoming your demands, and your demands consuming you? I mean, what is it? What do you find yourself craving so bad that you would rather die than live without it? This kind of overstated despair is also connected to another manifestation you see here of jealous manipulation. You see it in verse 2, and it's misplaced expectations. Look at verse 2. Then Jacob's anger burned against Rachel, and he said, "Am I in the place of God, who has withheld from you the fruit of the womb?" What's her expectation of Jacob? She's kind of lifted him up to some kind of God-like pedestal, wanting him to produce what only God can produce. That's a misplaced expectation. I mean, Jacob actually states it. Who do you think I am? Do you think I'm God? I can't give you a child. I'm doing all I am capable of to provide a child. Jacob loved Rachel. He devoted himself to her. He really despised Leah. He wasn't likely withholding any kind of intimacy from Rachel. So his anger is burning. That's beyond being just flared. It's just as raging and it's just as out of control as is her jealousy. And no doubt her jealousy is actually fueling more and more his anger. Never forget this about jealousy. Jealousy rarely achieves righteous responses from other people. I mean, we express our jealousy, and rarely in return do we get wonderful, compassionate, righteous responses, do we? But we still do that. We're still tempted to do that, to express our jealousy. Jealousy never breeds a compassion from those for whom you spew your jealousy upon. You see what Rachel is demanding? I want you to give me what God alone can give. That's a misplaced expectation. There's another manifestation of jealous manipulation we see here. I call it self-centered plans. Self-centered plans. This is what jealousy does. Jealousy so consumes you that it makes you plan all around yourself as the center point. That's what happens in verses 3 through 4. So, she doesn't break down and say, "You're right, God is the one who controls this, God is the one who's in charge here." She doesn't say that. She actually violates God's original plan for marriage. Notice verse 3. Fine. Then here's my maidservant, Bilhah. Go into her, that she may bear on my knees, that through her I too may have children. So she gave him her maid Bilhah as a wife, and Jacob went into her. I want you to think about this for just a moment. Jacob might have been wrongfully angry. Maybe his anger and his rage expressed itself in a wrong way, but he wasn't theologically wrong. He wasn't theologically wrong. Rachel's issue with Jacob wasn't Jacob. Rachel's issue was actually with God. You know, if she was really concentrating on who God is as a sovereign, good, all-knowing, kind, merciful, loving God who loves those whose hearts ache in grief, and if she really embraced a good theology of God, which she had to have known at least some of through the history of their family, she would have stopped. She would have prayed like Hannah did and cast herself at the feet of a good, sovereign God and the ultimate plans that He has to fulfill His promise. But she's not God-centered in her life. She's not God-centered in her approach because she's fueled and driven by jealousy. So these plans of hers are all wrapped around herself, not God. And obviously this sounds familiar. It sounds just like her grandmother-in-law, Sarah. And you would think that Rachel would know better. Obviously she would know the account of Sarah and Hagar. This was so prominent in the life of the family. That obviously didn't dissuade her because she's so fixed on what she wants. Her jealousy rules her. What does she mean here in verse number 3? That her servant Bilhah would bear on my knees. It's an interesting phrase. It's only found a couple of other times in the Bible. Some believe it's an ancient phrase that simply means and refers to adoption. But more than likely, referring to her knees, it likely means that Bilhah would bear in submission on her knees, at her knees, in submission to Rachel. That is, the children that she bears would be born at the knees of Rachel, belonging to Rachel. We'll see this phrase again in Genesis 50, verse 23. Joseph saw the third generation of Ephraim's sons, also the sons of Machir, the sons of Manasseh, who were born on Joseph's knees. These were the sons that actually belonged to Joseph. It's a physical birth, but it's in submission to one other than the one giving birth. Now you have to ask yourself the question too, where's Jacob in all of this? What's he doing? Where is he? Well, he's right there. He sees it all, and what's he doing? What's he saying? Nothing. Nothing. I mean, listen, this is not God's plan for marriage. This is not God's plan for childbearing. This is not God's plan for covenant keeping. This is not what He's revealed. Jacob says nothing, just giving in to the jealous rage. Maybe this will quiet her. And just like that, Bilhah conceives. She conceives. You see it in verse 5. Bilhah conceived and bore Jacob a son. Do you notice what Moses did here? He's the author, the narrator here, indicates that Bilhah's son belongs to Jacob, not Rachel. But jealousy is often blinded to the facts, blinded to the outcomes, blinded to truth. Shows another manifestation of jealous manipulation. We see it in verses 5 to 8. It's misreading providence. When you're so full of jealousy that it's consuming and controlling everything about you, you're so focused on yourself, you start misreading providence also. You start interpreting all the results as if they're favorable to your jealousy, as if God were approving of your jealous intentions. You see that in verse 5? Bilhah conceived and bore Jacob a son, and Rachel said, God has vindicated me and has indeed heard my voice and has given me a son. And therefore she named him Dan. Rachel assumes here, doesn't she, that God has approved of her jealousy. I got the results I wanted. I got what I was looking for, so it must be God's favorable expression to my desires. She misreads God's providence. He isn't telling her, oh yeah, jealousy's fine. You just need a little more of that and see you get good results from jealousy. No, she's misreading providence. She actually sees it as a personal vindication by God God has vindicated me. The word vindicate is literally the word judged. God has judged me to be right. He has looked at my circumstances, He has looked on my heart, and He's judged me to be higher than Leah, better than Leah, right in my offering up my maidservant. God's looked at the whole situation, at least from Rachel's perspective now in her misreading providence. He's looked at the whole situation and said, well done, have a child. You see that this is not about God restoring a broken-hearted saint who's been seeking His will here. This is not a harassed woman like Hannah, inappropriately persecuted for her barrenness and now being publicly vindicated by God's kindness. That's not what's going on here, is it? No. This is a woman assuming that the results of her sin are signs of God's approval of the sin. It's kind of like saying, look, I successfully robbed a bank without getting caught, and now God has blessed me with newfound wealth. No, God isn't blessing with newfound wealth. He's not approving thievery. But she names her son Dan, or Bilhah's son that's born to Jacob is named Dan, which actually means vindication or judge. So every time that she looks on Dan, she assumes that God has approved of her jealous actions. But it actually gets worse than that. She doesn't look at this as just mere personal vindication. She actually looks at this as personal victory over God. Look at verse 7. Rachel's maid Bilhah conceived again and bore Jacob a second son. So Rachel said, this is so fascinating. Rachel said, with mighty wrestlings I have wrestled with my sister, and I have indeed prevailed. See, this is not about Jacob. This is not about children. This is not about God's promise. This is about her gaining a foothold against her sister. And she says it here, with mighty wrestlings. Now, literally, the word mighty here is the word for God, Elohim. Elohim. It is okay to translate it as mighty, talking about something strong, but more than likely it should be understood as her God wrestlings. With God wrestlings I have wrestled. Wrestlings is a term that literally means crooked or to twist, which is what wrestling is, isn't it? It's twisting someone up into a pretzel so they can't move until they give up or you pin them. She sees that she's been wrestling with God. These are God wrestlings. It's almost as if she said in response to her husband's rebuke when he said, who do you think I am? God is the one who opens or closes the womb. She says, fine, I'll fight with God until He gives me what I want. And through her twisting maneuvers and jealousy, she thinks she's pinned God in an impossible situation where He has to give in to her. I have prevailed, she says. I have had God wrestlings, and I have prevailed against my sister. Look at the arrogance that this jealousy has produced in her. She thinks she's beaten God. You've bested God? Really? It's not just fascinating in the arrogance that she has, but you have to hear here also the foreshadowing in this. Because what's going to happen in just a few chapters down the road in chapter 32, who is her husband Jacob going to be wrestling with? None other than God. And he's going to tell God, I will not let you go until you bless me. He wants to prevail against God, just like his wife. It's as if Jacob and Rachel they see themselves as the tag team champions against God. Overstated despair, misplaced expectations, self-centered plans, misreading providence, all expressions of jealous manipulation. You know what? If you think about it carefully, this is just like the contours of the curse you would expect as they flow out of what we read in Genesis 3 when Adam and Eve had sinned and God had pronounced the curse. Do you remember that? Eve in Genesis chapter 3, she wanted self-exaltation. She wanted actually to be removed out from under God's control because she wanted what she wanted, what would make her godlike. She wanted to best God. She wanted to have a role of leadership even above her own husband. We see the curse of sin coming out again, don't we? And we see the curse of sin even in Jacob's passivity. Just like Adam was passive rather than instructing his wife, Jacob just stands back and gives in to all of this jealous manipulation at times. You remember the curse of sin in Genesis chapter 3 said that the woman would desire her husband, that is, to rule her husband, and he would come back and try to despotically rule her. And you might hear a little bit of that in Jacob's own response when he says in anger, "Who do you think I am, God?" But I hope what you see here in the backdrop of all of this too is through these contours manifesting the curse of sin through jealous manipulation, you see the faithful hand of God as well, don't you? You do. Who's in control of the womb? God controls the womb. Who's building every generation? God's building every generation. No matter what our sinful contours do, God is still building every generation. He's building the covenant nation here, isn't he? Because these are the sons that will comprise the covenant nation. He's reminding us of our need for dependence upon Him to see the long-term goodness of His providence in what He gives to others and even withholds from us. No, you see God's faithfulness here, despite the wildness of this particular contour of the curse of sin. Jealous manipulation. That's just one of the contours of the curse of sin, just one of them. There is another that we find in verses 9 through 21. I call it spiteful retribution. Spiteful retribution. Verses 9 through 21. Now, you remember, before we get into these verses, just look back up at chapter 29, verse 35. You remember Leah had 4 sons, and then it says in verse 35 of chapter 29, after she named Judah, then she stopped bearing. It doesn't mean that there was no intimacy between her and Jacob. Likely there was, but she no longer was fruitful. She was not having any more children. That sets up this next scene, because here it comes. Tit for tat, retribution. She's getting even. She's going to attempt to keep her foot on her sister's neck. The wrestling match between these two sisters continues, and Leah starts fighting back. This is a spiteful kind of retribution. Now I want you to see how it manifests itself. It manifests itself in a number of ways. First of all, you see her mimicking the sin of her sister. She's mimicking the sin of another. Verse 9, when Leah saw. Now, remember back in chapter 29, the Lord saw that Leah was unloved, so He gave her children. And now, Rachel saw in verse 1 of chapter 30 that she bore Jacob no children, and here is Leah saw that she had stopped bearing. There's a lot of seeing going on here, recognizing what's happening. Leah saw that she had stopped bearing, so she did what her sister did. She took her maid Zilpah and gave her to Jacob as a wife. What one can do, the other can do as well. What a mockery of marriage this is. What a mockery of the covenant relationship between a spouse. What a selfish approach to marriage and even parenting. My husband exists for my status. My children exist to extend my privileged place of priority above others. Yes, this is a little bit worse than the soccer moms trying to put more child reward stickers on the back of their van. I mean, you can kind of see this, can't you? Leah saying, I'll one-up you. I'm going to get more stick figures of children to put on the back of my van just so that when you see my minivan, you see I have a bigger family than you do. One person's jealous sin can actually encourage another to retributively respond in kind, can't it? So she just merely mimics the sin to go after a prize that she herself lusts after. It's a form of retribution. But also notice that this retribution is showing itself through a misplaced pleasure. A misplaced pleasure. Look at verse 10. Leah's maid Zilpah bore Jacob a son, and Leah said, "How fortunate, how lucky, how fortunate." So she named him Gad, just a word that means fortunate or lucky. And Leah's maid Zilpah bore Jacob a second son, and Leah said, "Happy am I, for women will call me happy." So she named him Asher. This isn't about her, friends. This is about her above her sister. This is not about good pleasure found in the gift of children. She doesn't care about these children as much as she cares about her own pleasure of priority and prominence above her sister. This is spiteful retribution. And she even names her children after her misplaced pleasure. How fortunate, how lucky am I? Here's my good luck son. So she calls him Gad. Or Asher refers to my happiness, my praise, my preeminence. This is misplaced happiness. And it's being used as a club for spiteful retribution. If only she had an Instagram account. You know what she would do with that account? She would be putting pictures of her children on there, not because she wants others to rejoice with her in the good fortune of God, which is maybe a good thing, but in her heart, she's putting pictures on that account because she wants to rub it in her sister's face. But that kind of happiness, friends, is rarely maintained. It's rarely maintained. The smile will fade. The true anger will arise in another way, at another time, and it will express spiteful retribution, which is exactly what we see happening next in verses 14 to 16. Here's another expression of this spiteful retribution. It comes out in anger, an angry kind of retribution. Verse 14, this really interesting account. Now, in the days of wheat harvest, Reuben, that's the firstborn, it's her firstborn son, and likely somewhere around 5 years old, perhaps, from what we can glean from the account. At wheat harvest, Reuben went and found mandrakes in the field and brought them to his mother Leah. And Rachel said to Leah, "Please give me some of your son's mandrakes." Now, what's going on here? Well, at the time of the wheat harvest, perhaps sometime in the spring, maybe late March to early June, Reuben goes out during the wheat harvest. Maybe he's going out with some of the men into the wheat harvest, or perhaps, we don't know for sure, but perhaps she sends him out there intentionally, and he finds mandrakes. Now, maybe he stumbles upon them, maybe he's looking for them, but he finds mandrakes. Now, this is so interesting because mandrakes, this little fruit, they're very prevalent in the region around the Mediterranean, like Palestine. But where Jacob and Leah and Rachel are now living somewhere north and east of that area, mandrakes are not quite, according to some scholars, they're not quite as prevalent. They could be found there, but they're not as prevalent as down near toward the coast of the Mediterranean. So, what is a mandrake? Well, it's a little fruit, looks a bit like a tomato in size and in color, and it grows at ground level with no real stalk. It's more like a vine with large leaves that spread out, and they begin as a violet flower, a large violet flower that eventually produces a fruit. They have a very distinct color, they have a very distinct odor that many, especially in the ancient world, found attractive, so attractive that many in the ancient world at this time looked at this fruit as some kind of aphrodisiac, a love-producing fruit, a fertility-enhancing fruit. In fact, some in other generations referred to this fruit, the mandrake, as the love apple. It's actually mentioned in the Song of Solomon, which is where you think you would find something about love apples, isn't it? Song of Solomon, chapter 7, verse 13, "The mandrakes have given forth fragrance, and over our doors are all choice fruits, both new and old, which I have saved up for you, my beloved." I've saved up all my fertility fruits for you, my love apples. Now, isn't this providential? Wheat harvest, the 5-year-old goes out and stumbles upon, or perhaps is she sending him out intentionally to find them because she's not bearing children? So perhaps she sends out her 5-year-old, find some mandrakes somewhere out there while everybody's wandering around the wheat fields. Go find some mandrakes for me. And evidently, the 5-year-old comes back, and this is a public bragging right. This might be some indication that this was intentional, that Leah wanted this, and when he found them, it becomes publicly known. Look, Reuben found mandrakes for his mother, because Rachel hears of it, and she goes, and she almost sounds humble. Please, may I have some mandrakes from your son? Verse 15 is actually just nasty. Look at verse 15. She said to her, "Is it a small matter for you to take my husband?" I almost laugh every time I read this. What are you asking? Do you not remember what you did, Leah? Who stole whose husband? And now you're accusing Rachel of wanting to come and steal your husband? The irony is just amazing. But here, you want to steal my husband. You want Jacob to be exclusively yours. And now you want my mandrakes to make you fruitful, to make you fertile, rather than me. You're trying to pull away my honor as well. And look at Rachel. She's so consumed with having more children, she just gives in and says, fine. You take him tonight. You get Jacob tonight. Just give me the love apples. Now, for a moment, if you didn't actually know how conniving Jacob would be, for a moment you might think, oh, poor Jacob. I mean, he's caught in the middle of this, really? But listen, Jacob's no innocent person, is he? Verse 16, when Jacob came in from the field, almost unsuspecting, I would imagine, he comes in from the field in the evening, and Leah went out to meet him and said, "You must come in to me, for I have surely hired you with my son's mandrakes. I gave away my love apples, but you have to come into me tonight." And he's so passive. He does. He just gives in. Just gives in. I mean, this is just amazing, isn't it? This angry retribution of what Leah does to Rachel leads to another expression of this spiteful retribution. It's another misreading of providence. Another misreading of providence. Look at verse 17. God gave heed to Leah. Why would he do that? Why would he give heed to this spiteful woman? He does, and notice she conceived, without any love apples, by the way. She conceived and bore Jacob a 5th son. And so Leah said, God has given me, in my spiteful indignation, in my spiteful retribution, God has given me my wages because I gave my maid to my husband. God has rewarded me for giving another woman to my husband. Isn't that amazing? That's what happens when you're so full of spite and retribution and revenge, you can't see things the way they should be seen, and you assume that God is rewarding your own sinful actions. That's how she interprets it. And notice verse 19. She conceives again, and bore a 6th son to Jacob. And Leah said, God has endowed me with a good gift. Now my husband will dwell with me because I have borne him 6 sons. Now he'll leave Rachel, and he'll come pay attention to me because I've given him all these heirs. 6 sons through her own womb, 2 others through her maid. Misreading providence. That's what happens when you're full of spiteful retribution. Let me show you one other, and we'll move on from this, but let me show you one other just a manifestation of this spiteful retribution. It's found in verse 21. I call it ignoring good, genuine gifts. Ignoring genuine gifts, good gifts. Look at verse 21. Afterwards, she bore a daughter and named her Dinah. Now, why do I call this ignoring good gifts? Notice her response every time that her maid or she has a son. Oh, it's this elaborate expression of happiness and why she's come up with this name. Nothing is said about Dinah. Nothing is said from Leah here about her daughter. Nothing is said about her name. Nothing is mentioned about her at all. She wasn't interested in a daughter. Leah didn't want a daughter. The daughter wouldn't give her husband an heir. A daughter doesn't provide her a leg up on her sister, more public status for herself. Although the name is interesting, the name Dinah is actually the feminine form of the name Dan. And you remember Rachel had a son through her maidservant and named him Dan, saying, "This son vindicates me over my sister." So here's Leah saying, "Oh, I have a daughter. This vindicates me over my sister." Just spiteful retribution. Now, likely Dinah is brought up here in the passage by Moses because this sets us up for the unbelievably tragic events of chapter 34 and what happened to Dinah. But you see it, the spitefulness is thick, it's painful, it's pitiful. And through all of this, you see the contours of sin. You see the contours of the curse through this spiteful retribution. Through Leah's spiteful retribution, you see the curse being played out all over again. The woman having desire to rule her husband. Leah demanding Jacob's intimacy, manipulating for it. You even see the woman's pain in childbearing, showing the priority of motherhood and the prize of motherhood and the pain and the struggle within motherhood being played out here. You even see the curse of sin again in Adam's passivity, shown in Jacob's passivity again. But God, He's showing Himself faithful. He continues to build the promised nation. He answers the cries of the despised and rejected. He blesses the rejected even though they are sinful. Jealous manipulation, spiteful retribution, all of these expressed here as a contour of the original curse of sin being played out again. Let's look at the third and final contour of sin. It comes right at the end of this section that we're studying, verses 22 to 24. I call it dissatisfied recognition. Dissatisfied recognition. That's another contour of the curse of sin, a dissatisfied recognition. This is almost heartbreaking to see where all of this messy sin leads. And really astounding that all of this messy sin finds God's preserving grace too. Why do I say preserving grace? Well, look at the opening phrase of verse 22. Then God remembered Rachel. That is a precious phrase in the book of Genesis, friends. That is a beautiful phrase in the book of Genesis. And it always points to God personally reminding Himself, rehearsing to Himself His promise in such a way that He will preserve the people connected to that promise. For example, it was used in Genesis chapter 8, verse 1. You remember Noah? In the midst of the flood, and the entire earth is flooded. Verse 1 of Genesis 8. But God remembered Noah. In fact, it goes on in chapter 9 of the book of Genesis when He preserves Noah and his family. He says in chapter 9, verse 15, "Then I will remember my covenant, which is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh." It says it again in verse 16 of chapter 9, "I will look upon it," that is the bow that's in the cloud, "to remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature." When God remembers, He preserves. He remembers His covenant, remembers His promise, and He preserves the people attached to it. That same phrase is used of Abraham. When God destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, it says in Genesis 19, verse 29, Genesis 19:29, it came about when God destroyed the cities of the valley that God remembered Abraham. What does that mean? Had He forgotten Abraham? Did He forget who he was? No, He remembered the promise that He made. He remembered Abraham and sent Lot out of the midst of the overthrow when he overthrew the cities in which Lot lived. When God remembered Abraham, he remembered the covenant promise. Now he remembers Rachel. That means he didn't forget Rachel, didn't forget about her, didn't have a lapse in memory as to who she was. No, not at all. He remembers her in the most preserving way. He gave heed to her. Just as he gave heed to sinful Leah, he gives heed to sinful Rachel because he remembers his promise. And he gave her a child. This could be after a decade of marriage, too. And personal barrenness. God opens her womb all of a sudden in verse 23. So she conceived and bore a son and said, God has taken away my reproach. He's taken away my reproach. Given me a child. I have my own child. That's probably an indication that she didn't think that her stepchildren, as they were really the stepping stones to public vindication that she hoped they would be. And you know what? The last verse in this passage is where her dissatisfaction comes out all the more. What did she see in her son? Oh, God has vindicated me, yes, but she doesn't name him after her vindication. Notice verse 24, she named him Joseph, saying, may the Lord give me another son. What does Joseph mean? Joseph is a name built off of the word another. She named her only son that she has personally, she names him after her dissatisfaction and lust for more. Wow. It's fascinating because who would be the son that would actually preserve all the rest of the brothers? Joseph. God remembered her and provided her a son who would actually preserve the whole nation. And yet she's dissatisfied with the gift that God has given her in that beautiful son. It's fascinating to see. Misreading providence again. Misunderstood approval of sinful actions. Constant dissatisfaction even when God brings abundant blessing. That happens when a heart doesn't really want to be under God, just wants something for self-exaltation. Just like Eve. Just like Eve. She didn't want to be under God. She wanted to determine right and wrong for herself. She wanted to be on a godlike status. She wanted more for herself, not what God had given. He had given them the beautiful garden, the perfect creation, and everything except one tree. And she's dissatisfied with all of that because she wants the one thing that can give her what would exalt her above everybody else. It's just like Rachel here. It's the contour of the curse of sin again. But friends, don't you see the faithfulness of God? He gives her a son that actually preserves the whole nation. I hope you see that in this account. God will not allow the curse to corrupt His promise. More personally, I want you to think of it this way. God will not allow your sin or my sin, the sin of others against us, to co-opt God's promise from being fulfilled just as He designed it. Isn't this scene profound? I mean, it's so messy in all of its sinfulness, and yet you look at it and you see and the aerial view of God of all of this, and it looks winding and twisting and terrible, and yet you see from God's perspective it all looks fairly straight, doesn't it? Faithful. He is faithful. You see all that He did. He gave heed to Leah. He gave, in verse 17, He gave heed. In verse 22, He remembered and opened the womb. He's faithful. That's what God does. That's what God does. Our sin does not define God's faithfulness, nor does it thwart His faithfulness. Our sin does not dissolve God's faithfulness. That's why we take heart. It is often difficult at times for us to see how God can get glory through people like ourselves who fail so often in such tragic ways, who so often have such terrible moments of jealousy and spite and dissatisfaction, all demonstrating the normal internal contours of the curse of sin. But friends, with every turn and every contour of the curse we see in ourselves, at every juncture where we see God showing kindness to undeserving sinners, we are seeing the faithful hand of God despite our sin. And we're reminded, God keeps His promises. He keeps His promises. He preserves His people. You know what we call that? We call that the gospel. That's the good news. It is God conquering the curse of sin through His faithfulness to His promise to save. I mean, why would He take on flesh, live a perfect life, sacrifice Himself, the Lord Jesus, in death as an atonement for people who are so selfishly sinful like us? And they treat us as if God would treat us then as if we possess the very righteousness of His own Son, and treat His Son as if He held our sin. What do we call that? The gospel. God is faithful to save the worthless, and He shows grace and mercy to the undeserving. And as the curse of sin remains, here's what we always keep in our minds: so does the faithfulness of God. It's not a reason to keep on sinning. But despite our sinful inclinations, God transcends it with His faithfulness. And He will do so until His preservation ultimately wipes the curse away forever. And that's what we see here. God's faithfulness highlighted even amidst the contours of the curse of sin. Let's pray together. Father, show us this truth. Show us this truth personally, profoundly, specifically. Help us to linger on what we have heard here and studied together, and I pray that it benefits us so that we live righteously before You, dependently on You, seeing Your hand of blessing despite our sinfulness. And I pray it would cause us to repent, to be humble, to turn from our selfishness. God, help us. We need Your intervention and Your help. I pray for those outside of Christ, that they would see that their sin doesn't keep them from You. Their sin can be overcome by You. Through what You've accomplished through Christ, You can overcome their sin. And You long to show them mercy as they come in faith before You. Remind us all, Lord, as we struggle, You are faithful. As we confess sin again and again and again, we are reminded over and over, You are faithful, faithful, faithful. Thank You for another reminder of Your mercy. Use this effectively in us for Your glory, we pray in Jesus' name. Amen.